This next lecture is going to be about exercise training adaptations. So I would like to start with the three big principles of training that exist. So principle of overload, principle of specificity, and the principle of reversibility. So you can use these principles to kind of guide exercise prescription and when you're designing exercise training programs and rehab programs. So a principle of overload basically says for a tissue or system to improve its function, you have to subject it to a stimulus that it's not used to. So if you want to become stronger, you overload the muscles by lifting more weight. If you want to improve the cardiovascular system, you overload the vascular system by doing cardiovascular based exercise, aerobic exercise like jogging further and further or at a faster pace. So that's the principle of overload. To see improvement, you have to constantly overload the system. And then specificity refers to the fact that training adaptations are specific. And this could be specific to a part of the body or even just specific to a system or even how you're training a system. So, for instance, a drastic example would be if you lift weights with your upper body, you won't necessarily get stronger with your lower body. If you train train aerobically, you may not see massive changes in muscular strength because that's not being specific for improvements in muscular strength. Even within a given modality of exercise or type of exercise, like aerobic exercise, there is some specificity at play. So, for example, if all you do is bike for aerobic exercise, you may not be the best runner. So if your goal is to be like a great runner or participate in maybe a half marathon or marathon, your primary focus of training should be on running. So even though biking or swimming might be aerobic exercise also, and you will get some carryover effect, training is also specific to the specific modality that you're doing. And then lastly, the principle of reversibility is referring to the fact that you can lose any adaptations that you get via training. So if you train for a while and you get in really good shape and have these nice improvements to your cardiovascular system, if you stop training, they'll reverse and you'll lose these adaptations. So how I would like to frame this lecture, I want to talk about physiological adaptations to aerobic exercise. And that's going to be the bulk of this. And then we'll talk about resistance training adaptations after that. And so I have this set up basically by the systems that are adapting. So aerobic training adaptations, I'm going to start with cardiovascular just because we get a lot of cardiovascular adaptations due to aerobic training. So aerobic training, we're referring to like running or biking or endurance swimming. So some type of endurance exercise. So first of all, let's start with the heart. So cardiac dimensions. One of the big changes you get or big adaptations you get with the heart is that the left ventricle increases in size. This is due to a chronic volume overload of the left ventricle. If you can envision every time you go out and exercise, your stroke volume is going up to increase your cardiac output, that's putting a little bit of stress on the left ventricle. It's taking in more blood and more blood because you get this increase in venous return that's increasing the preload. So your left ventricle is going to adapt to that by becoming bigger. So you get this enlarged left ventricle. Going along with that, blood volume. So one of the first adaptations you get to exercise training is an increase in plasma volume. So plasma is the water portion of the blood, and this is due primarily to an increase in plasma proteins. So you have all these plasma proteins in the plasma. By having more plasma proteins due to osmosis, it's just going to kind of pull in more fluid. So you can expect about a 12 to 20% increase in blood volume due to an increase in plasma volume after a short period of training. And this happens usually within a week if you were untrained and then you started training. Heart rate, it depends how it adapts, depends on if we're talking about resting, sub-maximal exercise or maximal exercise. And this is true for a lot of variables. But what I wanted to show you in this graph is that one of the big adaptations you get to aerobic exercise training is a decrease in resting heart rate. So you're going to see a few of these graphs. So yellow is kind of like people who haven't really exercised. The blue line, or turquoise line, represents those same people after they train for about 3 months. And then a second group of people, the purple line, is competitive endurance athletes, like maybe competitive runners or competitive cyclists. So if you just look at their resting heart rates, you can see there's a pretty big difference. So just by training, even as someone who is untrained, they train for a while, their resting heart rate drops. If you look at an endurance athlete, it's even lower. So key point, there's a reduction in resting heart rate with aerobic training. We look at submaximal exercise, and what I mean by that is just an exercise intensity that's not maximal. So we can take somewhere in here. So you see the same effect. So exercise training results in a decrease in submaximal heart rate. So you see that clearly. And again, like for the same intensity, the endurance athletes, their heart rates are going to be a lot lower than their untrained counterparts. Then lastly, maximal heart rate. This one's a little tricky, but just to make the point I'm trying to make, I'm going to have you focus right here. And you can see that even though this group of people is untrained, they had a resting heart rate of looks like a little over 80. Their max heart rate looks like it may be around 190. Then they train for a while, their resting heart rate goes down to 60. It's a pretty big change, but their maximal heart rate stays the same. So that's a point that I would like to make. So exercise training by itself doesn't have a massive effect on maximal heart rate. It affects resting heart rate and submaximal heart rate, but not really maximal heart rate. So it looks a little different right here. Like if you look at the endurance trained people, you might say, oh, well, their maximal heart rate is a little bit lower. Yeah, but you can also see the opposite. So there's no consensus. Well, I will say there is a consensus that maximal heart rate does not significantly change with aerobic training. What will happen though is sometimes it might go down, sometimes it might go up. So it can do some different things, but when you look at kind of all the data out there, there's no consistent change. So we generally say there's no consistent change with max heart rate with aerobic training. So back to this picture here, I just wanted to bring this up because it's on the slide. This is reinforcing the cardiac dimensions. So you can see this is someone who was competitive and they started training for the Olympic Games. Over 4 years, you see their left ventricular diameter went from 55 millimeters to 57 millimeters. Doesn't sound like a big change, but that is a pretty significant change in left ventricular volume. And then they went 6 years of detraining, 10 years later, so 6 years without really doing anything. And look at principle of reversibility takes over and it goes back and actually is less than it was here. All right, so moving on, stroke volume. Remember, stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of a ventricle each beat. So resting stroke volume, so let me show you this graph right here. So this is untrained, this is trained, this is stroke volume on the y-axis, and so this is resting, and these are different intensities of exercise. So resting stroke volume definitely goes up after training. You can see that right here. During submaximal exercise, it's also higher. It's actually been more different. And then even at maximal exercise, stroke volume is much higher. This is really important because this is one of the big reasons that our aerobic capacity increases after aerobic training, because we're able to increase stroke volume much higher after training. So the mechanisms, the big one is increased preload. So after training, you get more venous return, which increases the preload. Remember, we have an increase in blood volume. We have an increase in left ventricular chamber size. All those things allow the left ventricle to fill up more and eject more blood. The stroke volume is going to go up. And then on top of that, the heart can also adapt to where it fills up at a much quicker rate. So even though stroke volume may be, because we know stroke volume, it depends a lot on the heart filling up during diastole. And so if during high heart rates, the diastolic time period decreases, so you have less and less time to fill it up. But with training, since the rate of filling has increased so much, even at really, really high heart rates, you can continue to increase the filling and thus the preload and thus the stroke volume. So stroke volume goes way up after aerobic training. Cardiac output, which remember is dependent on heart rate and stroke volume, is shown in this graph. So same three lines we saw previously. But resting cardiac output, if you look at this, there's no big difference between the three groups. So untrained, trained, and then highly trained. Reason being, stroke volume likely went up, whereas resting heart rate likely went down. And they're going to cancel each other out, so you don't really see any difference. However, when you look at during exercise, you can start to see that cardiac output, at least maximal cardiac output, which I'd like to focus on, is greater after training. So untrained and trained. So even though maximal heart rate doesn't really significantly change, max stroke volume did, so that's going to cause them to have a higher cardiac output at maximal intensity exercise. And then if you look at these highly trained individuals, it's way higher. So increase in cardiac output, the big difference in maximal cardiac output is driven mainly by that increase in maximal stroke volume. And then the AVO2 difference, remember that's a measure of oxygen extraction. And so resting AVO2 difference, not really different before and after training. And reason is you don't really need to extract that much oxygen after training. But maximal AVO2 difference, you can see after training, is higher. And then in the endurance trained group, it's also elevated. But a point I always like to point out on this graph, if you look at the people, this is the group that kind of went from being untrained to 3 months of training. If you compare their maximal AVO2 difference to that of an elite endurance athlete, it's actually not that different. So reason being, so there's just kind of like a maximal capacity to extract oxygen from the blood. And you can get to that in a relatively short period of time. So as far as mechanisms for this, so more mitochondria definitely is going to allow you to extract more oxygen, and then more capillaries in the muscle is going to allow you to extract more oxygen too, because you have more oxygen delivery. All right, so some other things, variables that you're familiar with: total peripheral resistance, which is big at determining our blood pressure. So resting total peripheral resistance is lower, and it's also lower during maximal exercise. So this is thought to be due primarily to less vasoconstriction. So you have less vasoconstriction at rest and also more dilation during maximal exercise. That's going to decrease your total peripheral resistance. So how that impacts blood pressure, remember blood pressure is dependent on cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. Well, resting blood pressure would be, we know resting cardiac output didn't really change after training, but since TPR goes down at rest following training, resting blood pressure should drop. So that drop in total peripheral resistance is the main reason that exercise is such a great strategy to reduce resting blood pressure. As far as submaximal exercise goes, pretty much same effect. Maximal exercise gets a little tricky because, and that's why I didn't put it up here, but for maximal blood pressure, I mean, most textbooks will say it's going to be lower because you get more reduction in resistance. However, it's possible that at least systolic will be higher after training, and that is if the person is able to work to a much higher workload. Remember, there's that nice linear increase in systolic blood pressure with intensity. So if they're able to work to a much higher workload, the systolic blood pressure will just keep going up. So it's not uncommon to have a higher systolic blood pressure at maximal intensity exercise after training. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just is a product of your cardiac output continuing to go up. As far as muscle blood flow, you have a better ability to redistribute blood to active skeletal muscle. So maximal exercise, muscle blood flow is going to increase. All right, some other variables: rate pressure product, which is dependent on systolic blood pressure and heart rate. So we know what those two variables do at rest, so they're going to drop. So resting RPP is going to be lower, submaximal RPP lower. For maximal exercise, I put variable just because, remember, max heart rate really doesn't change with aerobic training. And then depending on how systolic blood pressure responds. If it's lower, at maximal intensity, then RPP will be lower at maximal intensity. If it's higher at maximal intensity, it's going to be higher. So it just depends. It's variable. All right, and then lastly, VO2 max. So VO2 max is our measure of aerobic fitness. It's a measure of aerobic capacity, so we know about VO2 max. It's definitely going to go up, as you would imagine, after aerobic training. Percent-wise, there's a pretty big range. The most textbooks state from 5 to about 20 to maybe 30% increase. So that's a huge window of change. And so that is the reason you get so much variability in how much you can increase your VO2 max, is because some of it is genetically influenced. And then also, it depends on your starting point. So it's kind of like the law of initial values. If you start really, really low, if you have a really poor aerobic capacity, you might get a 50% increase. If you're already at a decent level, it's going to be harder to get a big increase. So that's why there's so much variability in the increase in VO2 max with training. All right, so what determines VO2 max? So here's the Fick equation again. So VO2 is equal to heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference. We just rewrite this for maximal values. So VO2 max is dependent on maximal heart rate, maximal stroke volume, and maximal AVO2 difference. So we have to consider which one of these change with exercise training. And from our previous discussion already, we know which ones change. So maximal heart rate, not really. We say there's no consensus that max heart rate is going to significantly change with training. However, we get a huge increase in maximal stroke volume after training and a slight increase in maximal AVO2 difference after training. So these are the two variables driving VO2 max up. Max stroke volume, maximal AVO2 difference. All right, so what causes stroke volume to go up? Well, let's revisit what the determinants of stroke volume. So preload, which is determined by how much venous return. And we talked about changes in blood volume. We talked about increases in left ventricular chamber size. So that is, there are massive changes in increases in preload after aerobic training that increase stroke volume. Now, these other determinants can play a role. So afterload, remember that's the pressure that the heart has to push against. This should drop after training. So because you get more dilation, right? So it's a little bit easier to get heart out. So decrease in afterload can help increase that stroke volume. Then contractility. Yes, the heart has been shown to contract more forcefully and be more sensitive to catecholamines to allow it to contract more forcefully to eject more blood. So out of all these, preload definitely plays the biggest role, but we do get decreases in afterload and increases in contractility, which help drive up stroke volume. As far as maximal AVO2 difference, increase in mitochondria, that's definitely going on. You can pretty much double the amount of mitochondria that you have in muscle. And then increased capillarization. So more capillaries, more oxygen delivery. The other thing, myoglobin can go up, which transports oxygen in skeletal muscle. And so you'll see the big change in their type 1 or slow oxidative fibers. But yeah, so that can help with oxygen delivery also. All right, and here's a classic kind of flow chart of everything that goes into VO2 max. So you get increase in VO2 max after training. That's due to both a maximal increase in maximal cardiac output and increase in maximal AVO2 difference. Stroke volume is the big thing driving up that cardiac output, which is due to increase in preload, reductions in afterload, and then I also threw in increases in contractility. And the AVO2 difference is driven mainly by increase in capillaries and increase in mitochondria. All right, so after training, or let's say if you stop training, we get reversibility. So we call this detraining sometimes. So if you're trained and you stop training, you could expect VO2 max to decrease. So what would cause it to go down? Basically everything reversing that we've already talked about. So this is a graph that I like to show because it's pretty clear in showing you like the time course of the reductions in VO2 max. And it's based on a research study done back in the 80s. But if you look at VO2 max in the black squares, you can see if we're going to assume at point zero, this person was well trained, and it's actually a group of people. This is these are mean data from a group of people. But you can see if they're well trained and they stop training for almost 3 months, VO2 max is going to drop in that fashion. Okay. So what they were trying to do in the study is figure out why it's dropping. Like, what's the reason? And we got some relatively clear answers here. So if we look at maximal heart rate, does it really change? For some strange reason, it goes up initially, but then it's pretty consistent. So we can't really attribute this decline in VO2 max to any change in max heart rate. So then we look at other variables. Let's look at cardiac output. Well, cardiac output pretty much is the yellow line. It pretty much follows that VO2 max line for the first 21 days. And then it kind of plateaus. So I think it's safe to say that that initial decrease in VO2 max is highly dependent on a decrease in cardiac output, in maximal cardiac output. And then the other thing that goes into that, so what determines cardiac output, heart rate, and stroke volume? Well, we already determined the heart rate actually went up for some strange reason. But if we look at stroke volume, you almost see that same exact pattern. So it looks like cardiac output and stroke volume are following each other. So it just shows you how dependent cardiac output is on stroke volume. All right, and then if we look at maximal AVO2 difference, it's pretty consistent for the first 3 weeks or so. And then you start to see that gradual decline. So remember, AVO2 difference is highly dependent on mitochondria and capillaries, whereas stroke volume is highly dependent on blood volume. So remember, blood volume is one of the fastest changes we can get, one of the fastest adaptations. It's also one of the fastest to leave if we stop training. So I think this huge drop in stroke volume within the first few weeks is highly due to a decrease in blood volume. And then the changes that govern maximal AVO2 difference take longer. You remember, that's like, so decreases in mitochondria, decreases in capillarization. Those changes take longer, so they manifest themselves later in this detraining process. All right, so that's it for the cardiovascular adaptations. What I wanted to now is talk about some other systems and touch on it. Remember, most of the adaptations we get with aerobic training are going to affect the cardiovascular system. But for metabolic adaptations, so the O2 deficit, which is kind of this space right here, the lag or the delay in increase in oxygen consumption at the onset of exercise. So basically, you're going to, after training, you'll get to a steady state more rapidly, and that actually decreases the O2 deficit, because you're better able to rely on oxidative metabolism at a faster rate at the onset of exercise. So previously, before training, this big space would have been your oxygen deficit. After training, it's smaller. All right, so other things related to metabolism. So better ability to use fat as an energy substrate. That is a major adaptation we get. And so why does it make sense to use more fat as an energy substrate? Just because we're not going to run out of it, and we do get a lot of energy from it. Even though carbohydrate is actually more efficient, fat is useful to have because we can still get a lot of energy from it, and we pretty much have an unlimited supply of it. So why do we use more fat? More mitochondria, more capillaries, so you're able to use oxidative metabolism. And remember, the only way to use fat is with oxidative metabolism. Increased beta oxidation enzymes, so all of those enzymes that are utilized in the beta oxidation process that break down the fatty acids and convert them to acetyl-CoA, you definitely increase that. And then better transport of fatty acids, so getting fatty acids into muscle cells. That's going to allow the body to rely more on fat also. As far as lactate goes, so remember, lactate is formed from carbohydrate metabolism. And so pyruvate is sometimes converted to lactate instead of entering the mitochondria. So lactate production is actually lower after endurance training. One of the big reasons is that we metabolize more fat. So remember, lactate comes from carbohydrate. So if we're using more fat, that means theoretically less lactate is going to be produced. The other thing to consider is removal of lactate. So after training, you get just an amazing ability to remove lactate. So remember where lactate goes. It goes to skeletal muscle to be oxidized. It goes to the heart to be oxidized. Some goes to the liver to go through the Cori cycle. All of those things improve after aerobic training. So you're definitely more blood flow to the liver to go through the Cori cycle and gluconeogenesis. And then also improvement in those lactate shuttles that shuttle lactate to either the heart or, more specifically in this case, to other skeletal muscle cells, so you can actually oxidize it for energy. So with that being said, less production, more clearance, the lactate threshold is going to shift, and it's going to increase. What I mean by increase is shift to the right. And so if you look at this graph, we see that maybe pre-training the lactate threshold was somewhere in here. After training, it shifts to the right. So that means you can work at a higher intensity before you get that increase in lactate or lactate accumulation. All right, in respiratory adaptations, we get a little bit. So tidal volume tends to go up at rest and maximal exercise. Breathing frequency, so your respiratory rate will actually decrease at rest and should increase at maximal exercise. So what that gives us for pulmonary ventilation, remember pulmonary ventilation is dependent on tidal volume and breathing frequency. So if tidal volume goes up at rest, breathing frequency goes down, they offset each other. Maximal exercise, both go up, thus pulmonary ventilation is going to be higher after training. And that's the other variable to consider with ventilation is the ventilatory threshold. And remember, it's highly related to the lactate threshold. So you get that same shift to the right. So you work to a higher workload before your ventilation really takes off. All right, so resistance training adaptations. So weightlifting adaptations. So we're going to get increases in muscle size, muscular endurance, and also muscular strength. So just quickly, we've defined these words already, but muscular strength, maximal force that a muscle or muscle group can produce. Muscular endurance, generally defined as ability to make repeated contractions against a resistance. Or if you're talking about static endurance, like holding a position without fatiguing. So you'll get improvements in all those things. But what about we'll talk about muscle shortly, but cardiovascular changes, are there any with resistance training? There actually are. So with the heart, whereas aerobic training, we saw that increase in chamber size. With resistance training, you tend to see the opposite. You get what's called a concentric cardiac hypertrophy, which is an increase in wall thickness. And so you get an increase in wall thickness of the left ventricle in particular. And this is thought to be due to elevated pressure. So every time you lift weights, your blood pressure goes up significantly, more so than aerobic exercise. And so just like the heart had to adapt to aerobic exercise, that volume overload, now it has to adapt to a pressure overload. And one way it does that is to increase the wall thickness and add more muscle to it. And so the reason I put that number in here, this just gives you an idea of sometimes how high blood pressure can get during heavy weightlifting. So this has been actually recorded before. And so you could imagine what kind of stress that's putting on the heart. But if this is an ongoing thing and somebody's lifting weights on a regular basis, I don't see this as a bad thing. It just, the heart has to adapt to it. So as long as it's done in a gradual manner, you can get to situations where blood pressure can significantly go up and there's no risk whatsoever because the heart has adapted to it. All right, as far as mechanisms for improved strength, so we get neural adaptations and we get more hypertrophic adaptations. So neural adaptations are related to the nervous system. So after training, we get better motor unit recruitment. So we recruit more motor units, better motor unit synchronization, so they work better together. And then also potential inhibition, or I should better say desensitivity of the Golgi tendon organ. And we've had that discussion. And then muscular enlargement, the fibers get bigger. So with weightlifting, a lot of these are more so in the fast twitch fibers than the slow twitch, but both should increase in size. So as far as what's causing the fibers to get bigger, Even though these aren't muscle cells, I just want to make a point here. So if we wanted to just say from here to here is the size of a muscle, or better yet, here to here, this is what we're starting with. So we have 4 muscle fibers, just as just an example. Obviously, we have more than that. And after weightlifting, if this whole thing from here to there was the size of the muscle, after training, the muscle may be this big. All right, so there's 2 things going on here that are possibilities. So in this case, each fiber just got bigger. We call that fiber hypertrophy. And so each fiber got bigger, thus the entire muscle is bigger. Another option is, what if the fibers stayed the same size, but they just increased in number? And that's called fiber hyperplasia. So the question, this is an ongoing question people have, but what's causing muscles to get bigger? Is it that each fiber gets bigger, or is it that we just increase the number of fibers? So in humans, this is what most people agree on. So fiber hypertrophy. So it's not thought that humans have a great ability to increase the number of muscle fibers. There's people who still argue this and still trying to show through research that it might happen on some degree. For the most part, the consensus is fiber hypertrophy is the big reason that our muscle cells, or our muscles in general, are increasing in size, not hyperplasia. What's interesting is in other species, hyperplasia is not uncommon. And so that's why a lot of people, I think, also think, well, there must be some going on in humans too. But for the record, most people agree that fiber hypertrophy is the big reason that muscles themselves get bigger. All right, so what causes this? Well, it's a complicated pathway, and so I'm going to leave it at this. There's a pathway called the mTOR pathway, which is kind of thought to govern this. If we keep it as simple as possible, you can see resistance training leads to a whole cascade of events, signaling pathways, which result in protein synthesis. So muscle fibers are actually increasing due to increased protein within the muscle fibers. So the end result is protein synthesis. So complex signaling pathway leading to protein synthesis. The other thing I wanted to bring up about this is the role that these cells called satellite cells can play. These are cells on the external part of, or periphery of, skeletal muscle, and so found near the sarcolemma, and they can replicate. So the stress of exercise, in particular resistance training, causes these satellite cells to replicate and then move into the muscle cell. And you kind of see that going on here. So you get a cell that looks like it's resting, and then there's some damage that says myotrauma. That could be resistance training. All right. So in response to that, the satellite cells replicate and provide more nuclei. You know that skeletal muscle is multinucleated, in that more nuclei can help govern more protein synthesis. So the end result is providing more nuclei to support increased protein synthesis. So it was initially thought that each satellite cell might become a new muscle fiber, but that's since been shown not to be the case. So the satellite cells do replicate, but they don't become new muscle fibers. They just provide more nuclei to govern more protein synthesis. All right, and here's an old school graph that's still relevant. So if we look at training duration of resistance training, strength goes up as we would expect, and then there's some plateau at some point. And to get past the plateau, you could use steroids if you wanted to, not recommended, but it's possible. But I guess the big point of this graph is that there's a plateau at some point, and strength is increasing. So just to change the subject for a moment, getting past this plateau is something worth considering and coming up with strategies to do that. And there's different ways to target that, but it's hard, and there's no simple answer in how to do that. So that's a story for different training programs, and like kind of like if you do different cycles, the periodization you do through phases where you're working on more strength or more endurance, that can help get past those plateaus. But again, that's more of a complex exercise prescription discussion. But the reason for this graph is to show you that initial improvements in strength are mainly neural. So the neural adaptations that we talked about are primarily responsible for increases in muscular strength at the onset. Then later you get more of these hypertrophic changes, and that's increase in muscle size and mass. And here's another graph showing the same thing, that kind of training duration. They're showing that initially a lot of the improvements in strength are due to neural, and then those drop off quick, whereas the hypertrophic changes increase as time goes on. Now, I know they're saying about 4 weeks is where you start to get these massive improvements in hypertrophy. However, that's going to vary a lot depending on who the person is. And lastly, these are just some adaptations to resistance training, just a list. So we talked about the number of muscle fibers not really changing. That would be hyperplasia, but we said that there's not a lot of evidence for that. Size of muscle fibers definitely goes up. The type, really don't get a consistent change in type. That's another hot area of research, and what can happen to the distribution of muscle fiber types with training. But definitely an increase in strength. For mitochondria, I just wanted to focus on the density. So density decrease, I would agree with that, meaning that even though you might have the same amount of mitochondria, if the muscle size increases, then the density of the mitochondria is going to be lower. As far as volume, overall volume of mitochondria, and I know it's saying decrease, but depending on whether or not you're doing any aerobic exercise, that may not necessarily be the case. So I would focus on density here. Enzymes, creatine kinase increases, so that's our immediate pathway, so that improves. Myokinase, also immediate pathway, that goes up. Enzymes of Glycolysis, so PFK, which we know is anaerobic in nature, part of the glycolytic pathway, that increases because resistance training is an anaerobic activity. Lactate dehydrogenase, no consistent change, not sure exactly why. Aerobic metabolism and enzymes. So carbohydrate metabolism are going to go up because remember you can use carbohydrates anaerobically, and even though they're talking about aerobic, think about recovery from resistance training. So you do a set, you're using pretty much 90-something% anaerobic metabolism, but during recovery, you're going to have to use aerobic metabolism to replenish creatine phosphate. So what substrate is that likely coming from? Well, it's likely a lot of carbohydrate as opposed to triglyceride. As far as ATP storage, increase, creatine phosphate, increase, glycogen, which is anaerobic in nature, increases. Triglycerides, no changes. You wouldn't expect because that's more of an aerobic adaptation. As far as Vo2 Max, for traditional weightlifting, no real change. If you're doing some type of circuit routine, you might get a slight increase, maybe even like CrossFit or something, which is a lot of resistance training, but done more in a circuit type setup, because there is an aerobic component to that, so you might see small changes in Vo2 Max. They usually say about 5 to 6%. As far as connective tissue, ligaments and tendons improve in strength to support the increased muscle strength.